The Ghost in My Brain, How Concussion Stole My Life, and How the New Science of Brain Plasticity Helped Me Get It Back. Dr. Elliott has been a professor of artificial intelligence and cognitive science at DePaul University for 28 years. He holds 3 teaching certificates for music, a bachelor's of music, a master's of music, a master's of science for computer science, and a PhD from Northwestern University's Institute for the Learning Sciences with an emphasis on computer simulations of human emotion. He lives with his wife and daughter in Evanston, Illinois. He has raised 4 other children, studies Tai Chi and music every day, and continues as a casual marathon runner. And it's my honor to present Dr. Clark Elliott.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here today. I feel very strongly about these topics, and thank you, Sherry, for happening across my book. I did write The Ghost in My Brain, How a Concussion Stole My Life, and How the New Science of Brain Plasticity Helped Me Get It Back. There are many more resources that can be found at clarkelliott.com. I brought quite a bit of information today, so I'm going to go fast. If I go too fast, hold your hands up, and I'll slow down. This is an epidemic around the world. There are countries that are worse than the United States, such as Canada, where they play a lot of hockey and they slip on the ice, or in Europe, where they ride bicycles. There are 5,000 head injuries every day in the United States alone. That is between this time now and this same time, about 11 o'clock, 10:30 tomorrow, there will be another 5,000 head injuries, and those are only the ones that are reported. This leaves us with 6 million identified people who are living with the long-term impairments from head trauma in the United States. And this affects all classes of society, from our staunchest, most heroic and brave military people who are getting these blast concussions in the Middle East, to girls soccer. When you're 12 or 13, I hear from parents all over the world writing about head injuries from girls soccer, from babies that end up with learning disabilities and other problems that ultimately sometimes can be traced back to these head injuries, but most typically are just caused by head injuries and never traced back to the original source, to those that are in their 80s who slip on the ice and are thought, well, you're just getting old, but in fact it was a head injury. We are just coming out of the dark ages now. You will find so many cases, and I hear about them from people who write to me almost every day, that they hear you're troublesome and have mental problems, or who knows, maybe you have drug problems when they come to the emergency room. Please go away. There's nothing we can do for someone like you. As mentioned, we have the military, who are traditionally have been treated as cowards, or those with shell shock, or nowadays treated as malingerers because they're not functioning very well anymore. Or as in sports, you're not tough enough to go back into the game. Or if you're old and you get a head injury, most typically the diagnosis is, well, you're just getting old and your memory is going and you're not as sharp as you used to be. Or maybe you have been diagnosed with attention disorder or other learning problems, and it was never considered that actually this came from that head injury from snowboarding or falling off your skateboard. And often you will see difficult children that are being given a structured discipline, which is exactly the worst thing that could happen for those that are that way because of head injuries. So even though we are coming out of the dark ages, now we've moved to the phase, I think, which is you have a brain injury. Now, please go away. There's nothing we can do for you. So at least we're diagnosing the brain injuries, but still the treatment is we don't have one. But I hope today that I will tell you that there are some very exciting new treatments, and the biggest frustration is that so many don't know about them. The need is great, and the interest is increasing, possibly primarily because of sports injuries in the NFL. But the result of this is, since the publication of my book a year and a half ago, I've spoken to more than 10 million people. To be honest, it's probably closer to 15 million, but conservatively 10 million people through radio and TV interviews in the last year and a half. This is a topic about this is a talk about the concept of brain plasticity. And in a nutshell, the idea of brain plasticity, which is fairly new in acceptance in the scientific community and the medical community, that the brain is plastic and adaptable, that by and large it is a general purpose device, and that healthy brain real estate can take over processing for parts that have been damaged. And this is not traditional thinking in psychology and in medicine over the last century. This is a talk about my own odyssey. I lived almost a decade with a head injury. I'm one of the very few who ever recovered from this kind of injury, and I know exactly how and why I got better. The Ghost in my brain was written with three purposes in mind. The first was to capture the experience of brain injury itself, the real story of just one life. Perversely, I took notes from the very first day of my injury, and I don't know why. But I was absolutely scrupulous about accurately reporting the bizarre experiences that kept happening to me. I think as an AI scientist and as a professor of computer science that was studying some of the hardest problems I could come across, I just thought, well, at least it's interesting, you know? So there's a silver lining to this cloud of living with brain injury. It's an experience that I haven't heard much about, and nobody seems to know much about it, so I'm going to take notes. Surprisingly, it's the details that have proven more important to so many readers, even than the hope of getting better. It was the simple acknowledgement that they weren't crazy that has been so important, that their experience was real, and that they were not alone. I get email, as I mentioned, from around the world almost every day. It's tailing off a little bit now in the last month or so, but I think their voices need to be heard even more than mine. So let me read just a couple samples of the kinds of things that show up in my email queue, or I hear from people on the street that have seen me on TV and stop me, or I get phone calls. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm telling my friends, read this book and you'll know who I am. I'm telling my family, read this book. This is my life. This is what happened to me. I'm storming back to my neurologist's office. I hear so much about neurologists. I'm storming back to my neurologist's office this afternoon to tell him, you see, I was not lying. I'm not crazy now, and I never was. This is what happened to me. This is what I've been trying to tell you all these years. Here's another story from someone at the, much older than the first writer. I'm the son of a woman in her 80s who was in a car crash 2 years ago. She has been exhibiting so many of the symptoms you describe in your book. She kept telling us, I'm not old. I've not changed except from the car accident. I know everything that is happening to me is because of the accident. But we didn't take her seriously. We thought, she's 80. She's old. She's getting senile. Oh my God, what a mistake we made. The Neuro-optometric tests absolutely confirmed what you said in the book, and she's already on her way back to us. She said, you write to Dr. Elliott and tell him how important this is to me. Before I die, I just wanted someone to believe me. You gave our mother back to us. You can't know how important this is to our family. And some of the more troubling ones come from the military. I was in the military, and I suffer from a blast-related MTBI. I'm writing to tell you that you were the first person to believe me in 6 years of living with this hell. Thank you, Dr. Elliott. I have just tears pouring down my face that you know what I've been through. I hear so often from the military, these toughest guys, men and women, and they talk about the tears running down their face just from the acknowledgement that they're not crazy and that there are others going through the same thing. Everyone else thinks I'm crazy and making it up. Every last doctor I have seen, they give me Vicodin and tell me to see a psychiatrist for my mental troubles, and on and on and on. You can read those and other reader comments at clarkelliott.com if that's of interest to you. One MD wrote to me and he said, I'm haunted by the vision of the faces of the people I see that I have misdiagnosed over the years. These faces stretch far off to the horizon. Over and over, I see a person I remember and think, it was a brain injury and I missed it. Never again. Your book has profoundly changed my practice. Second, I want to be a champion for neuro-optometric brain rehabilitation techniques. These techniques are based on hard science. There are 700 research papers related to neurodevelopmental optometry. You can find at the clarkelliott.com website. And these techniques work. Lastly, I wanted the book to be a celebration of the human machine. After all, I am an AI professor. The human brain is the most powerful computational device on Earth. Roughly speaking, about 50 million desktop computers worth of computing power. And that's not even the interesting part, but just considering the computing power, if we took these computers, these desktop computers, and laid them end to end, they would stretch from here to China with another 3,000 miles to spare, just to match the computational power of the single human brain. So tomorrow morning you can wake up and think, oh, pretty good. And I wanted to be, to also point out that I was in a unique position having this brain injury, that my brain often slowed down to where a task that ordinarily would take a second or two might take me 5 minutes to complete. But due to a quirk in the nature of my injury, I could observe this slow motion processing and record what was happening and later write it down to take the notes that ultimately resulted in the publication of the book. To observe the brain's complexity, its resilience, and ultimately, thank goodness, its ability to reconfigure itself. My recovery was based on the work of two brilliant Chicago area researcher clinicians. The first, Donald E. Marcus, a PhD out of Northwestern, who's developed cognitive restructuring as part of her specialization and uses, of all things, paper and pencil exercises to restore brain function. Paper and pencil exercises. And Deborah Zielinski, an optometrist, who uses neurodevelopmental techniques and prescription eyeglasses to restore brain function. So we're spending thousands, in some cases millions of dollars in development and thousands of dollars in the practice of complicated brain scanning techniques and drugs. In fact, the best treatments sometimes may be the simplest, paper and pencil puzzles and prescription eyeglasses when they are linked to brilliant people who know how to use them. And we are fortunate that they're right here in Northbrook. People come from literally around the world to see them. We could ask, are such case studies valid? This is not a statistical approach. This is more or less a 10-year case study with individuals self-reporting for the data. I am a professor of artificial intelligence and cognitive science, trained in brain theory, and I think that I am a good scientist. I took 1,200 pages of notes over the course of 8 years and then 2 years of recovery. There was no expectation that I would ever recover. The clinical tests were all consistent with me having a standard concussion, mild traumatic brain injury, and put mild in quotes. That's just the medical term for it. The best neurologists and the leading rehabilitation centers were all in agreement. I had a head injury. I would see possible terrorist improvement at 1 month, 6 months, a year, and 2 years. And beyond that, no one ever recovers. And they said to me over and over and over again, Clark Elliott, you will not recover. No one ever does. No one ever does. Learn to live with your symptoms. And yet, I showed dramatic improvement within just 3 weeks of beginning optometric and cognitive restructuring treatment based on the principles of the plastic brain. And I had a full recovery after 2 years, a full recovery in all ways after 2 years. In September of 1999, just down the street at Grosse Pointe Road in Oakton, I was rear-ended while waiting at a stoplight. I drove to work afterward, and I didn't think so much of the injury, which is the insidious part of concussion, is that we don't realize something quite important has happened. I was having a difficulty right from the moment of impact. I remember the police officer was in Morton Grove was asking me to give him my insurance card. And I managed to bring 6 pieces of paper out of the glove box, and I'm holding the insurance card as one of those pieces of paper. But I couldn't figure out how to give it to him. And I thought, well, this is odd. I don't know what to make of that. But, it never occurred to me that, well, you just had a brain injury. And that's why you can't hand him an insurance card, which should be the most trivial of all tasks. So ultimately, he took my license, and I had to go back to court to retrieve it, even though I'd been holding it in my hand all the time. I made 3 fruitless trips to the hospital, emergency room, and I was soon struggling to get through a single day. It was really not even until about the 4th or 5th day that I went to the hospital at all. And what had happened was I'd been struggling all day with a problem. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. So I stood in the living room and I said, you're a professor. You can solve this. And it's sweat pouring down my forehead, and I was so sick I thought I was going to vomit from the intense pain of this concentration. And after 15 minutes, I finally figured out that I'd put my shoes on the wrong feet 6 hours earlier in the day, and it took me that long to figure it out. I had persistent symptoms for 8 years. I was almost fully functional until I had to think, which is a hallmark of these head injuries. And then I suffered severe deterioration within minutes. That is, I was fine as long as I didn't have to think about anything. But then the simplest of mental exercises, like figuring out what I needed to take with me to the car, would cause this spiral that ultimately would left me unable to walk and unable really to do anything at all. My cognitive capabilities disappeared so completely sometimes that it was difficult to realize they were missing. And I'll give you an example that under times of brain stress, I could turn to the left, but I couldn't turn to the right because the right-hand side of my world had disappeared in a form of what we call neglect. You would think, well, I took 1,200 pages of notes, since this was a relatively common occurrence, that I would have written that down. But in nowhere in those 1,200 pages does it ever say, I've lost the right-hand side of my world, or I can't turn to the right. Why? Well, the answer is it's so gone that I can't conceive of the thing that's missing. And this is one of the very insidious parts of brain injury and why it's so difficult often to diagnose these cases. Because someone will come into a doctor's office or an emergency room and say, well, I don't know, I just feel funny. And someone will say, what's wrong? And they won't mention, oh, well, I've lost the right-hand side of my world, or I can't initiate action, or I don't understand what time means anymore, because they can't conceive of the thing that's missing. So watch for that. Those of you that are suspicious that there's a head injury, you might have to try and tease out what it is that's actually wrong. I was unable to initiate action in a form of what we call catatonia. For example, I couldn't rise from a chair after a meeting. I often had to be helped from a room. I could walk upstairs, but not down them, in something that was, I thought, this is rather odd. Why can I go one direction but not the other? I couldn't pass through doorways because I couldn't feel them. So you'll see this sometimes with head injury. Someone seems perfectly fine. They'll come to a doorway and they stop. And it's because they've lost the concept of passing through something, and until you can feel the thing, you can't pass through it. I almost froze to death several times crossing Grant Park, and I think, Sherry, you will have seen this in the first episode of the book. After giving an evening lecture, I would rest for hours and hours, and then I had to cross Grant Park sometimes in the winter to get to my car, where I would rest for another hour until it was safe for me to drive. But my body would move slower and slower till one step I could make, and then the right foot would go down, and then the left foot just wasn't going to move. And I remember several times standing there thinking, this is it. You know, this is the sort of somewhat sad way to go out from this life, that I will not be moving again, and all I have to do is walk, but I can't do it. And I'm losing feeling in my hands and my feet, and I know the signs of hypothermia setting in, but there's nothing I can do about it. I had balance problems, which is also common with head injuries. I couldn't take elevators. I couldn't ride trains. It was difficult for me to sit as a passenger in a car. And interestingly, there's a technical point that I'll mention here, that our balance systems have three channels of input that we use. One is, of course, our inner ear, and we all know about that. Second is our visual system. And third is our proprioceptive sense. When we move, our body senses that we're moving. And the link between our retinas and our brains with regard to balance is very complex. So on the one hand, if you think about it, if you move around in your chair, here, look at my finger and move around in your chair right now. Just move around. You notice that you have no trouble focusing on my finger. And that's because your proprioceptive system and your inner ear is making tiny micro movements in your retinas to stay absolutely focused on that finger. That's a very complex process. On the other hand, so you could say balance controls our visual system. And in addition, while you're moving around, now follow my finger. So move around in your chair and watch my finger, but move around, and you can see not only can you follow something that's static, but while you're moving, you can also do what we call pursuits, so that you can trace moving objects in the world around us. That's a very complex operation. When was the last time you noticed the 10,000 micro movements in your eye muscles that you will have performed in the last minute? Not common, yes, but when we lose it, now all of a sudden it becomes important. On the other hand, our visual systems are part of how we stay upright. So that if you stand on one foot, I won't have you do this now, but you can try right afterward, that usually we can stand up pretty well. You close your eyes, most of us are going to start to wobble around. And that's because we've removed, one of these three channels for staying upright, which is our visual system. So our visual system then provides balance to the body. It's a very complex relationship. Now, what would happen in my case is, because my visual system was damaged and my inner ear was damaged from the head injury, I had to take over using that damaged visual system to take over the balance that was ordinarily provided by an inner ear system. In my case, the inner ear was not working correctly. I had to overuse the visual system to stay upright. But now imagine that I'm listening to someone talking, and as I speak right now, if I say the beach or clouds, green monkeys, you'll notice that you are instantly translating speech into visual, for most of you, visual images, yes? And So we need our visual system to process sounds in the world around us and many other things. So if someone were to start talking to me, I now have to use my visual system to understand speech, to interpret meaning in what's being said, and I couldn't use my visual system to stay upright. That is, it could no longer take over from my damaged inner ear, and I'd start to lose my balance. And this is also a very complex relationship that's common with head injury, that someone is experiencing nausea and balance problems just because someone's talking to them. Or if they have to think about where they're going to go today, their hand is going out on the wall to try and stay upright, and they're getting sick to their stomach. If they sit there and do nothing, they're okay. All right, so in my case, the result was loss of balance and intense nausea within 5 minutes of beginning any task requiring visualization, such as listening to speech or even just thinking. I could think, I could stand up, but I couldn't do both at the same time. Pain is a difficult topic because we don't like to hear about it, but to honor those with these head injuries, it is constant in many cases with those that have head injuries. In my case, after 20 minutes of balancing my checkbook, I might need to lie down in a bath of ice water. You know, I would put pure cold water and I would lie down in it and put my head down to try and deal with the pain, and then I would empty the bags of ice from 7-Eleven to decrease the water temperature till I could get the pain, neck and head pain to quiesce somewhat. And this is common with head injuries. The signals to the muscles that do all of that eye aiming and head movement and spinal correction, they're all crossed up and the muscles get tied up in knots, causing quite a bit of pain. I had the complete inability to make decisions, and this is common also with head injury. I was perfectly logical. I had good assessment as always. I knew what would be a good decision, but when I would reach for the decision, there was just nothing there. Any of you had any trouble with age-related retrieval of nouns? Trying to remember that movie star? You can see them, you just can't remember the name? Well, this is like that. Someone could hold up a pair of, 2 hands. If I said, okay, we'll do it as an exercise. This is my left hand, here's my right. Just pick one at the count of 3. Ready? 1, 2, and you point. 1, 2, 3, point. The question is, how did you do that? Well, preceding that, you might see if I put $10 in the right hand and I say, if you pick the hand with money, you get to keep it. So you're going through the process of deciding what is the right choice. Turns out that that's actually an independent process from actually choosing. And I would experience that. I would decide what's the right thing I probably should do, and I would weigh the pros and cons. But when it would come to pulling the trigger on a decision, I couldn't do that. So you might say to me, all right, Elliott, pick a hand, and if you pick either one, I'll give you $1,000. And I'm thinking, it doesn't matter which one I pick, I just have to pick. And I'm standing there waiting for something to rise out of the ether where a choice would be made and nothing would come. And this also is common with head injury and inability to make decisions. And no multitasking. I could only do one thing at a time. If I was leaving the house and I stopped to think, do I have my keys, my body would stop moving. And that's very common with head injuries. And where this will show up, interestingly, is you could ask someone that you think maybe they've had a head injury. You could say, do you have any trouble cooking? And they'll tell you, oh, I'm burning things all the time in the kitchen now, because cooking is very much relies on multitasking. You're cooking the fish, you only want that to bake for 15 minutes, but at the same time, when the broccoli boils, you need to turn it down. And someone with a head injury, they can only do one thing or the other, and they end up burning the fish and then maybe the broccoli to follow. I was given by Donnelly Marcus this line drawing, and she said, copy this. It was on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And my task was to simply copy it to another 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And I think, this shouldn't be that hard. I told her, Donnelly, this is going to be hard for me. Now, there's kind of a humorous episode here. She'd known me for about 5 minutes when she asked me to copy this. And within just 30 seconds of starting to copy it, the paper would crumble up in my left hand and my eyes about an inch away from the paper. And I looked like somebody who was having a horrible cerebral palsy attack. And her assistant, Mara, was in the background holding up a sign and waving it around behind my back saying, do I call 911? Do I call for an ambulance? And Donnelly is watching me there, just about to fall off the chair, completely twisted up in knots. And it was only this dialogue, running dialogue, that I was speaking while going through this, saying, oh, don't worry about it. It's no big deal. Happens all the time. That she said, no, we'll just see how this goes. And later we could laugh about it. Anyway, so they didn't call 911. And that was starting, actually, then working with Donnelly began the miracle that gave me back my life in very short order. If I drew concentric lines like the following, just these simple objects, within the course of maybe drawing 10 or 12 of these designs here, I would start these side-to-side seizures. And if I had to do something like two-sided photocopying, sometimes it's necessary as part of modern life, you've got to make photocopies, it would leave me with these seizures like this that would last for almost 3 days. So you can see I was fairly seriously affected by the head injury. I had audio processing difficulties, which is a big deal with these head injuries, even though they're often misdiagnosed. I'll make the case that you might need glasses if you can't hear, and let me explain why. When we hear, as I mentioned before, and I say green monkeys, you will find that you're seeing green monkeys or blue elephants. How about if I tell you, don't see a road with a yellow car on it? Stop seeing that road with a yellow car on it. No yellow cars out there. And the truth is, you can't do it, yes? Because it's automatic processing, it's automatic turning of the audio signal into meaning, which is what makes us human. And this audio signal actually is, let's just pick a number, say it's 1 or 2% of the actual hearing in our ears. Once it makes it into the brain, the rest of the processing of that audio signal in the human world is the mental symbolic representations of the meaning of that speech. So if I tap a wine glass behind your right shoulder, you'll know it's a wine glass because you can hear that sound and you've translated it into the object, which is most typically visual. You know it might have wine in it. There might be a color, red. You'll think of last week I drank wine with my friends around the dinner table, and you'll see the room and the space between you and your friends and the meaning of that conversation. That's all visual processing. And so it's very common that when we are trying to process the audio signal and we're having difficulties turning the meaning into visual, symbolic, spatial symbols, that it may be the case that we actually need glasses to fix that because we can't hear. And I've removed the slide, but I think I'll put it back in here just by speaking to you. As an AI scientist and a cognitive scientist, I've come to realize that 50 to 80% of our brains get involved in visual spatial processing at some point. 50 to 80% of those 50 million computers stretching from here to China is devoted to visual spatial processing, and it gets to the very core of what makes us human, that ability to manipulate visual spatial symbols. I had an inability to plan. With calendars, I had great difficulty. And the reason for this, remember, when I tapped the wine glass, you were thinking a week before about drinking wine with your friends? Well, that gives you a feeling that we have an understanding of time, and time is sequential, that one day comes after another and flows from the past into the present and from the present into the future. But when someone would say to me, I'll see you at 4:30 on Tuesday, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, 4:30, Tuesday. I know that means something. And I can't figure out what that has to do with the geometric figure of a square on a calendar and the rectangle of 7 squares laid out for the week and 4 of those rectangles making a month, and the idea of 3D depth that one month is stacked on top of another. I couldn't understand any of that because I had lost the cardinal property of numbers. If I saw the number 5, I could understand that there are 5 things in a set. There are 5 of them, but I couldn't understand that 5 is greater than 4, and 4 is less than 6, the ordering, the ordinality property of numbers. And without ordinality and ordering, of course, we don't get sequence, and without sequence, we can't make any sense of time at all. So time is very much a challenge, often, for those with head injuries. The sad story of Junior Seau, the linebacker, a very famous linebacker in the NFL, who committed suicide, most likely because of the results of living with a head injury. His family reports in the press how difficult it was for him to understand, could you come to the game? Your child's game is this afternoon at 4:30, but he just couldn't seem to figure out how to be there at 4:30. And I'm fairly certain that he was going through similar challenges with time. The loss of sensory filters is really a terrible thing to when you experience this. I couldn't stop incoming sounds and visual patterns, and I couldn't stop attempting to process them in the same way you can't stop processing blue elephants when I say them. But when you can't turn off all of the symbols coming through, it just becomes this unfiltered sensory explosion that can't be turned off, and it can only be described as madness. It's like Just being in the room right here, I'm seeing every color at once. And the fact that there's a bright light for me coming from the projector, and that there's someone walking by outside, and just a little bit of echo coming from the microphone, all of that's coming all the time at once. It's like having a bell lowered over your head and someone with a large sledgehammer hitting it, and you have a searchlight shining in your eyes, and someone's waving, brimstone under your nose. It's really sometimes the worst of having a head injury is that you just want to run for your life, but there's no way to get away from it. And then, of course, there's the alienation that comes from this. It's the private joke among concussives. Welcome to life as an alien. Welcome to life as an exile from the human race. It's intense. It's so intense. It's pervasive and it's permanent. Like many, I longed to be human just once more, to return home, but with the realization that it would never happen again. I would have given a great deal just to have one really bad day as a human being again. But at least I'd be human. It's a difficult experience to describe what it's like to have a body and to speak and have people treat you pretty much the same. But no, I'm not here anymore. I used to be. I have some memory of what it was. But that life is gone, and I'm gone. And then in January of 2008, I was one of the very, very few who experienced a recovery. As I mentioned, up until that point, all of the specialists I'd seen, all of the hospitals, all of the MRIs and brain scans, CT scans, X-rays, neurologists, and so on, really you could boil it down to, yeah, you have a head injury, could you go away now? I mean, it's not that they weren't well-meaning, it's just that there was nothing they thought that they could do, and I made them uncomfortable by being there. But Donnelly, as in Donnelly Marcus, called me back on this great day, and she had a plan. I was quite surprised. She tracked me down that afternoon and said, Elliott, where have you been? I have a plan. I know what we're going to do. When can you come in? I want to see you again. So she developed this with her colleague, Deborah Zielinski, the treatment plan based on neuroplasticity, the idea that a brain is reconfigurable. Healthy brain tissue can take over for damaged brain tissue. And let me mention, we hear about, oh, he had a concussion, but after a couple of weeks, you got better. You'll hear that's the most common result is functionally we return. But everybody pretty much knows that the brain injury is permanent. The tissue is damaged, and it doesn't grow back. It's just that the brain naturally works around that damaged tissue. But this is true because if you think in the sports world that once a player has had a bad concussion or a concussion that caused them to miss games, then when the next time contract negotiations come along, they're not worth as much because everyone knows that, well, once you've had a concussion, you're at greater risk for the second one and certainly for the third. Yes? It's because the injury is permanent. It's just that we naturally think, oh, it's fine because we've worked around it. But it's not actually fine. The injury is still there. And this develops the idea of working around the injury. So my brain is still damaged. It's just it doesn't matter anymore because healthy brain tissue has taken over the functioning. So Donnelly used context-free visual puzzles to rebuild cognitive pathways. Context-free visual puzzles, paper and pencil puzzles. We'll see a couple of those in a minute. And her colleague that she called right away, Deborah Zielinski, uses prescription eyeglasses to emphasize healthy pathways to the visual cortex, healthy pathways through my brain, and avoid the damaged areas that were causing me so much trouble. So remember that brain plasticity is the idea that the brain is plastic and adaptable, and that healthy brain real estate can take over processing for parts that have been damaged. So we can think of this process in my treatment as follows. Deborah Zielinski used neuro-optometric testing techniques, and I'll show you a list of them in a minute, to find healthy tissue in my brain. So she's using the retinas as input windows into my brain to find out where is there healthy tissue and where is there damaged tissue. And then she redirected my retinal input to that healthy tissue, working around the damaged areas. We could think of this as creating new dirt roads through that part of my brain. And then Donnelly took those dirt roads and using paper and pencil brain puzzles, we continually rehearsed symbolic processing and pushed my brain along the new pathways. So you recall, I mentioned that we are primarily visual spatial processing beings. This is who we are as humans. 50 to 80% of our brains get involved in visual spatial processing at some point. And that's where their focus was. So Marcus thus turned the dirt roads into the superhighways that supported, once again, visual spatial reasoning that was needed for my work as a professor of artificial intelligence. So here are some of the brain puzzles that Donnelly gave me. I don't have a pointer, but if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you can see there are a lot of dots and a couple of helper planes. And the task at hand is to connect the dots to produce the shapes in this lower left-hand corner down here. And this required visualization of the relationships between the dots and among the dots and among the shapes, and then the ability to translate that into the motor skills of actually writing out the figures. When I started with Dawn, I would work on these puzzles after maybe 5 months of working with her. When I started, she gave me a paper with 3 dots on it and said, "Clark, this is a triangle. I want you to find it and draw the triangle." That's where I started. Then she gave me 4 dots. So I would rehearse triangle over and over again. Then she gave me 4 dots and said, "Okay, there are squares. Can you find the square?" And I would connect the 4 dots manually, translation of visual spatial processing into manual processing. Remember, I'm standing in the park. I can't move my feet. I'm going to freeze to death. And the problem is I can't ascertain the visual spatial nature of the world and me in it. And without that, I can't make my feet work. And now I'm making a triangle. Oops, I'm sorry. I'm understanding what a triangle is again. And now I start to find in the real world, I understand there are 3 people here, and I'm not them. They are not each other. And we relate to each other like points on the triangle. I start to translate this into the real world in these remarkable ways. And over time, then I would work up to the puzzles like this. Here's another one. In this case, we're trying to recreate the object on the right-hand side using a sum of 3 partial figures on the left-hand side without duplicating any of the figures. So we have some lines on the left, and then we have some lines just before the equal sign, and I'm supposed to choose from the bottom, choice A, B, C, D, or E, to fill in the blank to supply the missing lines, but no duplicates. And this requires certain kind of cognitive processing. So if you look in the figure on the left, on the right-hand side, you see in the lower left there's a diagonal. You can see there's a diagonal line that makes the bottom of the figure. And over here, in choice E, we also have that diagonal line, yes? So we're doing constraint processing in the brain, saying, oh, it's a visual process. It can't be solution E because E has that diagonal on the lower left, and so does the figure, and that would cause the duplication of a line. But I'm having to learn all of this like a baby, like a 6-month-old baby again. And for us as adults, we think, oh, yeah, well, we just sort of automatically know that about the world. But it's not true. Our brains had to learn it at some point after the time we were born. So I had optometric treatment as well, and this was based on prescription eyeglasses. And I got 6 pairs over 3 years, and I'm still wearing the 6th pair right now. So we could ask, how does an optometrist emphasize neurodevelopmental brain techniques to reconfigure the brain? Well, first is the idea of testing, where Deborah Zielinski would change the input into my retina. She might change the color of the input. You know, she had that 4-opter when you go to get glasses, the machine that goes over your face, and she would change the, bend the light in certain ways with the lenses. And then she would, take these occlusions and tints and prisms and so on to change the processing paths through my brain, and then she would measure the output in my body. How was I focusing when she made that change? Could I grasp objects in the same way? Was my heart rate going up, and so on? So she made changes to the input to the brain and measured the output coming back from the brain and made deductions then about the processing that was leading from the former input to the latter output. And then she would ask herself, okay, how is the brain functioning? And where can I find windows through which we can work? And in my case, she used prism glasses, I think I'll mention these in a minute, to bend the light to different parts of my retina and then find these channels through my brain. And thus was greatly affecting my visual spatial processing, which, as we've mentioned, is at the heart of what makes us human. So some of the tests, I won't go into them, but I'll list a few here. The Padula visual midline shift, where we look to see where is the center of the world and where do we perceive the center of the world, and they might not be the same. And when you have a midline shift, if you're constantly having to put that world back together again, within minutes your brain becomes hugely fatigued and you experience all sorts of problems, and not just mental fuzziness and difficulty with things like initiation, but your spine might get twisted sideways and you're getting back problems, which actually are coming from needing glasses. The King-Devick test, which is a quite exciting test now being used by many sports teams, which is a reading test that can, within a few minutes, do a very good job of pre-screening to test for head injuries. And we're using those on the sidelines now for many sports organizations. the Lang stereo test too, where we look for the visual processing having to do with stereo. And I'll just mention this. I'm sure, it's perennially short of time, and I think I'll digress just for a moment here, is that I know of a case where this girl was having trouble studying physics. She was doing fine with math, an excellent student in reading, but for some reason physics was a lot of trouble. And so what Zielinski teased out was that she was having trouble with, of all things, depth and stereo processing. That if you might notice that if you look up close, put your finger right in front, you can focus here, and then if you look against the far wall and go back and forth, you can feel a little movement in your eyes. Not only, the in and out to adjust the angle, but also the focus of your eyes. Well, sometimes one eye is faster at that than the other. And the result of this can be, as it was in the case of this girl that couldn't study physics, that when one eye is lagging behind the other, that for a moment, the world is completely out of whack, and the brain is trying to figure out what's going on when there's two views of the world that don't overlap in a way it can understand. And the focus is also lagging behind, and so one part of the world is blurry. And the result sometimes is the brain just turns off the signals from that eye. You can still see, but your brain's not using that information, and you lose depth in the world. And you won't tend to notice that if it's happened to you. But what can happen is when you're trying to do the mental rotations, which are very depth, spatial in nature for physics, you can't do it, even though you're very good at math, which many times is much flatter in nature. So it's an interesting thing. Child can't study physics. The problem is with depth perception because one eye is lagging behind the other in its ability to refocus as you go from near to far during the day. Kind of interesting, yes? So these are the kinds of things this testing will turn up in the hands of a neurodevelopmental optometrist. There are 3 categories of retinal input, and we don't typically think of these, so it's worth spending just a moment to talk about them. We all know about the center vision pathway. That's when you look across the room and you see that object you're looking at. The truth is that center vision pathway is really just the tiniest part of our world, and from the perspective of being human, probably not the most important. Another pathway is the peripheral vision, and we get the idea that there are objects in our periphery that we're not looking at, but we still sense them through our peripheral visual processing. What almost no one knows about are these non-image forming retinal input pathways. And these are the pathways that come through the retinas. We don't use them for vision, but we still perceive the world. This sets our grounding in the world, the space around us. It's linked directly to body states. I'll get to these in a minute, like our sleep cycles and our emotions. And all of these are affected by glasses. So our dime-sized center vision accounts for only about 1,000th of the spatial world around us, of which we are aware on many levels. All right. So just a dime-size. If you're looking at my index finger, you're probably not looking at my middle finger, even from across the room. That we are that acute in that tiny of an area where our center vision lies. Neurodevelopmental optometry, by contrast with a normal optometrist, addresses the major portion of our visual spatial processing that's beyond center vision. So we can make the case. You can't hear, you can't think. As discussed, you might need glasses, in particular, to correct your peripheral vision, to correct all of the processing that goes through your retinas that's non-visual in nature but highly spatial, and the relationship between all 3 systems. Our hearing, as we mentioned, maps to spatial images because sound is giving meaning. Sound is giving meaning through images in our brains. We hear something, we see it. The non-image forming retinal pathways, this 3rd pathway I mentioned, is a collection of pathways that set our spatial grounding in the world. Remember I couldn't get through the doorway? Very likely because the non-image forming retinal processing is not working. I couldn't feel the door, and I couldn't feel me in relation to the door. That's non-image forming, but it is retinal processing. These pathways branch off to the brainstem and elsewhere after the retina. They don't go to the visual cortex, they go to the rest of the body through the brainstem. And these non-image forming retinal pathways set the context for peripheral awareness. They're linked to balance, posture, emotions, hormones, hearing, sleep cycles, spinal adjustment, spatial awareness, and so on. And this is something to think about when you go and get glasses. How many of you wear glasses or contacts? How many of you have had operations on your eyes to adjust, right? To getting by without glasses. The scary thing is it's highly unlikely anyone that gave you those glasses or did LASIK surgery has ever thought about these other pathways. And yet they are changing them because they are changed by lenses and by, filters we put in front of the eyes. And, it's kind of like if you went to an optometrist, and they just picked a pair of glasses off the board and said, here, wear these, right? There's no testing for these commonly. All humans have the hardware to interpret these non-image forming signals. They're a crucial part of what makes us fully human. I can give you an example. Imagine this giant spider falls down here next to the right-hand side of your head. Before you even see it with your peripheral vision, let alone, turn your eyes to look at it with your center vision, which may never happen, you're 30 feet down the hallway running for your life. And all of that is because the brain considers these non-image forming pathways to be most crucial for survival. And they will be dumping adrenaline into your body before you even begin to see. You can see 20/20 is something we might say. You can see 20/20, but your retinal processing is completely dysfunctional. And this is very, very common with brain injury. Phase one, when I got my glasses with prisms, these emphasized the correct visual, my peripheral vision. It actually blurred my center vision a little bit and restored the Gestalt scene organization, Gestalt visual scene organization, so that I could set the context for the thing that I'm looking at. And to achieve that, we actually blurred my center vision just slightly, and we built in some prisms to redirect the light to the healthy brain tissue. And we were trying to pry open a working window. And my experience of that was like being a baby that's maybe 6 months old, where I would start to feel those doorways again. I went through this strange period where I couldn't walk down the hallway, but I could dance. So I'm there at DePaul University dancing down the hallway, but I'm feeling good. It's like a baby awakening into the world, re-experiencing these parts that I had lost almost a decade before. And my brain was figuring it out. Well, what's happening is we're training those new parts of my brain that have never seen these input signals before. And the result of this is that within 3 weeks of beginning treatment, the ghost of who I had been returned in this phenomenal transition back to normal. That's the title of the book, The Ghost in My Brain, that the strange apparition was following me around about in the first week, about 30 feet off my right shoulder. And I thought, this is weird. I wonder if I'm finally becoming mentally ill, because I'd never experienced anything like kind of a ghostly presence back there. But there was nothing I could do about it. And each day, each week, it was getting a little bit closer until finally, after 3 weeks, it was about 2 feet off my right shoulder. And I remember standing outside my office trying to put my key in the door lock, which I could do for the first time in 8 years. I could find the center of the lock easily. And I realized, oh, that's the Clark Elliott I haven't seen in almost a decade. That guy that I always liked, that used to sail his boats around San Francisco Bay as a child and loved music so much and was so passionate about math as he was riding his bicycle up to the University of California, of all things, at age 10. And that guy was coming back. He was coming home. And I just went in and had tears flowing down my face, put my head down on my desk, and by the next day, the ghost had slipped inside of me. From a science point of view, I don't know. It might have something to do with Blank's research in Switzerland, this position movement disorder, where people can be shown to see ghosts if we manipulate their brains in a certain way. I don't know. And I certainly have heard about the shamanic transition of the soul returning to the body after, the body has become healthy enough that it can return. I don't know, but I can tell you I'm so grateful to Donnelly Marcus and Debbie Zielinski for giving me my life back. So the results are a complete resolution of all the concussion symptoms that I mentioned and many more that I didn't mention. Fully recovered. I am fully recovered in all ways. I have none of the symptoms that I had that I've described. In fact, I'm smarter and better than I was before treatment because we had to address some attention disorders along the way. That's a common theme with head injuries. Those parts that are weak are going to get worse. If you are late to appointments, you'll be later. If your kitchen drawers are messy, they're going to be messier with a head injury. This is well-established science. ClarkElliott.com gives 700 academic references relative to neuro-optometric rehabilitation. Feuerstein, and the precursor to Donnelly Marcus's work, has more than 1,500 scholarly references to his original work. My book has been endorsed by the Dean Emeritus of the Harvard School of Medical Education, the past president of the American College of Physicians, also by a cognitive scientist from the academic side with more than 20,000 scholarly references to his original work, and many frontline practitioners such as emergency medicine professors, whiplash trauma specialists, and so on. The book has been accepted, and these ideas of neurodevelopmental optometry are being accepted, and I'm very excited about that. So my thesis is that with 5,000 head injuries a day in the United States and 6 million people identified with long-term impairment from these head injuries that this is an epidemic. Jerry, it's an epidemic. And neurodevelopmental optometry works, cognitive restructuring with context-free visual puzzles work, and certain classes of MTBI are treatable. I won't have time, I think, to go through some of the science. I will just mention in 30 seconds. On the left-hand side, this is me about a month ago with my eyes closed, wearing my glasses. These are 19 channels of electroencephalograph, quantitative electroencephalograph measurements. And the red areas are measuring me as being 2 to 3 standard deviations out of norm in a not particularly important area, but the point is to show the effect. Now, also with my eyes closed, I put the glasses on. So the left is with my glasses off. The right-hand side with my eyes closed is with the glasses on. And you can see a huge change in brain state just from wearing, these prescription eyeglasses. How could this take place when my eyes are closed? Well, it turns out that the non-image forming retinal processing pathways operate with very low light. So when you close your eyes, you can't see, but all of that non-image forming retinal processing is still taking place. And so these slides just show that, in fact, these slides are de facto making changes in the brain. These glasses are making changes in the brain even with my eyes closed, emphasizing the neuro-optometric pathways that are non-image forming in nature. Okay, so I'm here for questions. This is the book, and thank you for allowing me to have a platform.
Hi, I was wondering if there's any possible application to brain damage caused by strokes.
I've talked to Deborah Zielinski and Donnelly Marcus both about this. And they're very constrained. Professionally, they have to, of course, be very correct in any claims they might make. But they both do work with stroke victims. And we can always say that oftentimes there are processing problems, that many people have processing problems, and we get by anyway. But with stroke, there are so many additional problems because any weak areas are going to be greatly emphasized. So what they will claim is that they can make people much more comfortable just by fixing any problems they can find. It doesn't necessarily address the problems of stroke, which are different because that's fairly massive and localized problems. But they can often make people more comfortable. And the brain, is plastic, so as you know, with stroke victims, recovery can take 6 years, 7, they're still doing better after all that time. And so personally, my feeling, and I'm not constrained by being a practitioner, I could say I would certainly go and seek the treatment. If nothing else, the neurodevelopmental optometric testing can show so much, and it's highly empirical. And it's just 3 hours investment, or 2 or 3 hours to find out, are there correctable problems?
I forgot to mention, anybody who's at the balcony with a question, please come to the stairwell. I'll be happy to help you ask your question. So.
Hi, thank you again. How many practitioners are there who are doing this? I mean, do people really have to come from around the world just to see the two that you saw?
There is a somewhat sad answer to that, is that I think the need is high. Personally, I believe that there are, in the United States alone, literally millions of people who could be greatly helped, and many of them are living with lives that are very, very difficult right now. And they just don't know about the techniques. They've never certainly heard of this book, never heard of me. And to directly answer your question, both Donnelly and Deborah Zielinski are unique on Earth in what they do. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not others that are doing very similar and very good work. There's an organization called NORA, the Neuro-optometric Rehabilitation Association. Their website is nora.cc. But you can find a pointer to that from the clarkelliott.com website. And NORA is a very active and very dedicated group of neurodevelopmental optometrists. And many of them are also showing very similar results to Deborah Zielinski. The difference with Zielinski's work is that she spends more emphasis with the non-image forming retinal pathways. And I think that that's a very necessary part of the processing, and doesn't do as much with what's called vision therapy, which is a more traditional neurodevelopmental optometric technique. But they're at the NORA website, and again, you can find that from the clarkelliott.com website. You can find at least neurodevelopmental optometrists in almost every state. The reason they come from around the world just to see Deborah Zielinski and Donna Lee is that their work is somewhat unique. With Donnelly's cognitive restructuring work, that's more rare. Donnelly is a little bit more of an innovator. But she is putting her puzzle work on iPads and on the internet. So some people might find benefit from that. It's not quite the same as the guidance that she will take a person through the 10,000 choices of puzzles that she's developed. But it's unfortunate. You know what's needed? Brilliant young people that are neuroscientists and recognize how important the neurodevelopmental optometry is, that we are visual spatial beings. So that's the crop of young people. It's kind of an interesting science because optometry doesn't really emphasize this. Neuroscience is very new, and medicine doesn't emphasize this at all. So there's hope, but I think the hope will come with the young people.
Hi.
Hi.
I loved your book. I teach writing at DePaul. And I first got interested in neuroplasticity by reading Nicholas Carr's article, Is Google Making Us Stupid? And subsequently his book, The Shallows, in which it has been documented that there are definite structural changes that occur when people use the internet a lot. So your book was absolutely wonderful, but what I wanted to ask you is there's a funny story in your book about going to the restaurant on Devon.
Yes.
And you could not, you were in some kind of a coping thing, rule following or something.
Yes.
And you walked past the store where the sign said, please come in.
Yes.
And you were having a hard time not going in the store. Could you elaborate a bit?
You know, there were humorous moments, certainly. This weird world of Clark Elliott coming up against the normal world, that there's opportunity for humor. And I was fortunate that I didn't suffer from depression. Many with head injuries do. I just treated each day as, well, these are some hard problems to solve. You know, I'm teaching a class at DePaul, you can imagine, and I discover I can't talk anymore. Or I'm writing on the board and my arm stops working. So these were interesting challenges, but as a professor, this is a joke among professors, this is our life. We solve hard problems. That's our profession. So I did treat this very much as a series of very hard problems to be solved. So there was opportunity for humor because it didn't really get me down so much. And of course I had 5 kids that needed their fathers, so I couldn't, I had to be working, I had to be on. And one of the tricks that I used, as you correctly mentioned, was rule following mode. Remember I mentioned that I couldn't make decisions. If you go out to dinner, for example, there are a lot of decisions to be made. Where do you eat? Who's coming? Who's going to drive? Where do you park? What's on the menu? And so on. That would, turn me into a basket case in short order. So I would put myself in rule-following mode, and my good friend Jake was very good about it. He knew what was going on. He said, I'm picking you up at 7:30. We're going to Tiffin on Devon Avenue. So I would just follow the rules. So when I was in rule-following mode, I would try to always follow the rule and never be left with trying to make a decision. So in rule-following mode, I come across this interesting problem as we're walking down the street with my friend Jake, who's a large man, and he's hungry, so quite peckish, not patient. And we stop in the middle of Devon Avenue. And he said, what are you doing? I'm hungry. Let's go. And I say, well, I'm trying not to go in this store. It was this store full of cheap electronics. And he said, why would you want to go in there? I said, I don't. I have no interest. And he said, then what are you doing, you moron? I said, well, notice the sign. The sign says, come in. It's an instruction. And the best I could do was to not go in the store, but I couldn't get my body going down the street. Fortunately, Jake, who was a large man, would, and very enthusiastically pulled me down the street down to the restaurant. So during dinner, he, would rib me. He says, you brain dead moron, what, do I have to cut your food up for you now? Right, so.
All right, hi. So I was thinking, because we grow up as visual spatial creatures, and this is neuro-optometry healing, what about people who are visually impaired and grow up, maybe congenitally blind? How would they have, respond to any kind of brain plasticity treatment?
This is an interesting question. We could take it to the end of the bell curve and say, what about people who are completely blind from birth? And so they have no retinal processing. There are a couple of things to say. First of all, many people who are blind are not completely blind, so there is some visual information coming in. Second, some who can't see are still getting that non-image forming retinal processing coming into their brain, and that's almost never considered. as a very important input channel, especially for people who can't see at all. And then lastly, even those who are completely blind and with no retinal processing, they're still visual spatial thinkers. That if you think about it, we have a 3D model of the world around us in 360 degrees in both directions, and we live inside that visual spatial representation of the world around us. And people who are completely blind still translate sound and touch of the world around them into that internal 3D spatial model. So while there are some differences that we will notice, like with the angle that a completely blind person will report between an object that's right in front of them and one that's 20 feet away, they won't show the angle is changing as the object gets farther away. But beyond that, so much of the processing they do is identical. There isn't going to be any retinal input to a person that's completely without retinas, for example, or where the signals have been trimmed. But I still think that the concept that we are visual spatial beings, including when we don't have eyes, is crucial to being able to repair damage that's taken place. And I suppose that it might have to come through the testing of the audio signal. Does that make sense? Yeah. So just to summarize, many people are blind, can see a little bit, even though technically they're legally blind. Second, someone might not be able to see at all, but they're still getting non-image forming retinal input, and that could be crucial to treat that. And the third, even if there's no input at all coming from the retinas, they are still visual spatial beings at the very core of what makes them human. And I didn't mention any of the part about the relationship to a spiritual life as well, and how hugely that changes with a head injury, because you no longer have a sense of relationship. And when that's gone, things change quite drastically in one's spiritual life and how we relate to others.
On the same line of thought, what about the Helen Keller story? Can you relate anything to this? She couldn't hear, she couldn't see, couldn't talk. How do you think she learned from all this?
That's an interesting question. I haven't thought about that one at all, especially without the hearing. But I guess my response would be very similar, is that inside, her hardware is designed as a visual spatial device. And that probably her, development, finally, after all those years, takes advantage of the fact that even though she didn't learn all of this as a baby, she could learn it as an adult, that the brain remains plastic throughout life. And that's once somehow through touch, those input signals could start getting to her. She probably went through something similar to what I went through when I got my neurodevelopmental glasses and worked on the puzzles. That would be my guess. I'm not sure. Is that consistent with what you think? I think the brain is plastic. Donna Lee has worked with people who have been 40 years or 50 years with no change in learning problems and difficulties from early stroke and so on. And guess what? The brain is still plastic and still ready to go, even after 50 years.
Hi, I was wondering if you could speak more about the glasses progression, and if the current glasses that you're wearing right now are in any way different from the ones that many of us are wearing? Sure.
These are just glasses. Okay. I could have gone to Pearl Vision and purchased them. In fact, one of the pairs I did, in a hurry. The only reason I got them directly through Deborah Zielinski's office instead of just the prescription and getting them elsewhere was that she works with a lab that she knows is very, very careful. But they're just prescription glasses. I happened to go through 6 pairs, but each case is unique in the same way that each personality and each brain is unique and each injury might be unique. So she treats, she sees many people who just need glasses. But in giving glasses, she also attends to what changes are we making in your peripheral processing and your non-image forming processing, which I think is like, this is crazy, right? To go in and make changes. We have 60 million input receptors or more in each retina. And this is processing information in real time. From a computer science standpoint, this is a phenomenal amounts of data coming in. The only processor on Earth that can even come close to processing that information is the human brain. And now we're changing the input that's coming in real time through these essentially parts of our brain that are hanging out the front of our faces here with glasses, with no attention to the retinal, the peripheral processing and the non-image forming processing, which makes it kind of a crapshoot is what we might be changing there. So anyway, that's an aside. That in my case, I had 6 pairs. The first pair emphasized the left-hand side of my world, more like I felt it as the creative part of my world. Even though, you know, research is suggesting maybe we don't really have that right brain, left brain division that we thought. My experience was we do. This was a very creative slice of my world. And I had prisms built in to bend the light from one side to the other, to a different part of my retina. And I wore those for about a month. And I love those glasses. They were a real challenge because, as mentioned, we blurred a little bit of my center vision, just slightly, to force me to start using my peripheral processing. And the idea was that we would increase my executive function, the ability to plan, by setting the context, the bigger picture. So we gave just regular prescription eyeglasses that happened to emphasize peripheral processing by blurring the center, and happened to have prisms that bent the light to a healthy part of my brain, but they were just prescription eyeglasses. After that first month, Debbie looked me over and said, "Good, we don't need those anymore. We're now moving up." And now she emphasized the right side of my brain, which was a little more logical, is how it felt to me. Much more grounded, a little less magical. I still had the prisms, and I wore those for about 6 months. At the end of that time, she said, "Okay, time to grow up." And she took out the prisms, and I hated that third pair. And she also addressed a problem where there was a little bit of an imbalance between the left side and the right side, so I was continually having to adjust, and then adjust, and adjust. I found when I took the glasses off at night, from the very beginning, I would regress by morning, so I wore them all night. And you know, I'm sleeping with my eyes closed, but that non-image forming retinal processing takes place all night. And what do that's visual related while we're sleeping? We dream. Highly visual process. In my case, I dreamt most of the time. I was very much a sort of dream-oriented sleeper. And so wearing them at night, especially in that first month, fixed my dreams, and they were much more productive. I solved a lot of the problems that dreaming seems to help us with that I wasn't getting for the previous 8 years. So then I had the third pair. I fought with those for about a year. And, of course, if I put them on, sometimes I would get a little fatigued, and I had 5 kids. I'm a single parent, and I'm trying to work through all of this. So I couldn't wear them all the time. I traded back and forth between my second pair and the third pair. At the end of a year, I just put them on exclusively for about 6 weeks and finished off the bulk, I'd say 90% of the changes. After that, I got greedy. So I'm feeling pretty good, but I went back to Debbie and said, "Debbie, I think we can do a little better. I'm a little fuzzy over on the right-hand side when I'm trying to solve these hard AI problems." And she's teasing out exactly what am I talking about, and she and her colleague, Dr. Kowar, so they gave me the fourth pair, and we fixed the fuzziness on this side. And then finally with the fifth pair and the sixth pair, they were minor tweaks till I just feel like I'm a rocket ready to take off. My thinking is crystal clear in all spatial areas. If I ask you to add 26 to 35, okay? Add those together, 26 and 35, right? All right, now most of you can point. Where did you perform that? Did you perform it behind your right knee? Point to where you did that processing. 25 plus 36. Show me where. Most of you can see that, yes? And that ability to visualize, and is it horizontal or did you do it vertically? See, you know that, yes? All of that processing was affected by the different pairs of glasses, so I got greedy toward the end, and I wanted absolute clarity in my ability to solve these hard problems. So they were strictly just prescription glasses. I lost my second pair. I was taking my daughter to the bank, and I think I left the glasses on top of the car when I was pulling the car seat out. And in the course of a week, right before I got my third pair, I regressed very, very significantly. My intuition is if I lost these glasses and went without them, I would slip back a little bit. But if I wear them even for 5 minutes in the morning, I seem to have reset. I can feel that, and I'm fine. We do see in that last slide, this slide we had here, that there are changes. That this is without my glasses, and this is with my glasses, with my eyes closed. So we know that it is affecting my brain, but not so much. Did that answer the? Yeah, and they are just prescription eyeglasses. There's no voodoo magic. You can buy them anywhere.
How did this experience change your conceptualization of what consciousness is? And do you think a highly scaled up intelligent machine could ever have consciousness?
I do have a chapter devoted to this in the book. I'm an AI scientist. I'm a cognitive scientist. You know, we need about an hour to answer that question. But I can just tell a couple of anecdotes. And in my case, I have always had a spiritual life. I feel connected to God and have from the time I was about 15. I had no formal religious training to speak of, and my family was not religious. But I used to say prayers for my students, and to be a good professor after class, I would go into the chapel at DePaul. There's no dogma attached, just I felt a connection here, and someone is listening, when I asked for guidance, and I felt guidance would come back in the other direction. And immediately after the accident, I remember going in, sitting in the chapel, and there's no one there. I thought, well, this is weird. So, I would say, kind of a typical prayer I might say for, guidance and to do a good job as a professor and for, students that might be having trouble. And it was just like, and I remember this very distinctly, it was just like reading a page from an auto repair manual. I have this 1985 sort of Colt Supra, and I've got this original auto repair manual that I have to consult sometimes if I'm fixing the wiring, whatever. And it was just like reading a page from that text. There was absolutely no one listening. And I thought, this is weird. And it gave me some insight to people who have spiritual lives, and some are very religious, but they report living their whole life without ever having an experience of any feeling of connection. They just do it purely on the faith or upbringing. And I thought that's an interesting, revelation for me, how difficult that is. So there was that aspect. And then, we could think, well, wait a minute. Clearly the brain is a physical device. You can make the argument it's a physical device, and there's software that runs on it, and that's just like a computer. It's a physical device and software that runs on it. Now, I got whacked in the head. The physical device has been broken, and I lost any kind of connection to God. This is kind of a weird thing. So you could say, well, that's evidence then that it's just a physical property of the brain, and that, it's just the brain sort of creating this awareness of being connected to something larger than ourselves. But that's not actually the complete answer, because you could imagine, well, if you're at the beach and you're listening to the waves crashing on the ocean, you can see, on the sand, you can see, well, that's the ocean there. If you go over the sand dunes behind them and you can't hear the ocean anymore, is it still there? And most of us would say, yeah, I just can't hear it anymore. So you could also make the argument, it's possible that these parts of the brain that we have that allow us to actually, experience a connection to something larger than ourselves, in fact, actually are connecting to something larger than ourselves, and that's the part that got broken. So it's not an easy answer either way. And then you can argue from an AI science standpoint, and I'll have to be real brief on this one, if we built a computer that was powerful enough, that had the equivalent processing 50 million desktop computers, and we don't have anything close to what the human being can do, or human memory. If we started writing down everything that the human brain can remember, according to the science, that possibly could remember, that if we're writing this down on sheets of paper, that it looks like that sheet of paper might end up, circling the Earth, several thousand times. The human memory is staggering. Or an interesting paper out of University of Leicester measuring what capturing the human mental state. And it turns out, so imagine, we have pretty fast network processing now. So imagine if we took all of the information that could contribute to a human's mental state, and we start shipping it from here to Denmark. Where's Stephen? We shipped it over there for the conference in Denmark, Stephen, at high-speed internet bit rates. And we use the European bit rates, which are much faster than the American version. How long would it take to ship all of the information in a human brain? So these physicists at the University of Leicester calculated that it would take, and are you ready for this? 13 times the known age of the universe. For one human, the content in one human's mentality. So these are staggering numbers to consider. But imagine we have a computer that's powerful enough to manage that kind of processing power. All right. Well, now let's take a human brain equivalent of the two, and we're going to replace one of the 180 billion cells. These are just the gray cells. Leave out all of the glial cells known to participate in processing that we never consider. And they dwarf the number of gray cells, just 180 billion gray cells, and replace one of those with a desktop computer that fully implements all of the network connections. We could probably manage that. Just one cell. We can handle that, right? Well, now, am I still human or are you still human if we've replaced one of your cells? Probably, yes? All right, now let's replace two. Fully functional. That implements every memory, every feeling, everything has been implemented. All right, so now you see where this is going. We replace all of the cells, and you are now completely implemented as a network of these computers, 180 billion representing each of the 180 billion cells. Is that computer you? Well, I don't know. From a computer science standpoint, I can't stick a pin in you. Why? Why can't we stick a pin in him? It hurts, right? Do you have a sense that's real? If not, we are sociopaths, or, the old argument where everything deteriorates into an argument about Nazis, right? We're not allowed actually to perform experiments by sticking pins in you. But as a computer scientist, I look at this machine over here that we've just created and are supposing is you. I'm thinking all we've done is change a number in the pain register from 9 to 16. We've changed the zeros and ones. I don't care about that. It doesn't actually feel anything. So you can see these are very thorny problems. But it was a real eye-opener for me to realize, this bit about the spiritual life and connectedness to the rest of the universe, that disappeared when I received a physical brain injury. There's some pretty strong arguments you can't avoid when that happens. Sorry.
Thank you